What's up, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Well Man's Podcast. My name is Bryan Brozy, and today it is just me, no Keoni. So I'm doing wonderful. Hope Keoni's doing wonderful too. But we're going to carry on with this episode sans Keoni, but he will be back shortly. And today's topic, what I wanted to discuss is this concept, or you may have heard a physical therapist say, motion is lotion. And what that's all about is the body is intended to move. The body is healed by movement, as a matter of fact. And there's a variety of ways that we can demonstrate this. And all too often in the clinic, when I'm working with someone, maybe they come in with pain and they leave feeling a little bit better, and they're amazed at the fact that movement alone helped them feel better. And this is not surprising when we know some of the basic science behind it. But overall, my goal today is to let you know that movement is okay. When you're in pain, movement may actually be exactly what you want to do to relieve that pain and get out of pain. And there's a variety of ways that we move that really help stimulate some things in our body that can help heal our body, reduce pain, and get us feeling better overall. So I'm going to kind of break that down here and try and do this without Keoni today. So bear with me, as it is just me. It's a little awkward, a little different, not bouncing off of somebody else. But so overall, in normal, healthy joints, they're lined with synovial fluid. And that synovial fluid we can think of as like the oil of a joint. It really helps lubricate the joint surfaces, make the joint surfaces more mobile on each other, and decrease that friction when two bones slide against each other like a joint does. This synovial fluid is filled with these compounds called glycoproteins. I'm going to break those down more in a minute, and hyaluronin, and I'm going to break that down further in a moment. But just to reiterate, that synovial fluid serves as a lubricating and shock absorbing boundary layer between moving parts of synovial joints. Synovial fluid reduces friction and wear and tear of the synovial joint, playing thus a vital role in the lubrication and protection of the joint tissues from damage during motion. So what that's saying is this oil within the joint, and when it says synovial joint, just know this is no hard, fast number, but probably 99% of your joints are synovial. Most of your joints are synovial. If your joint is moving, it's synovial joint. So those joints, the typical articulating joints, your shoulders, your hips, your back, all these things that we think of, your fingers are all lined with synovial fluid. And that synovial fluid, the oil of the joint, provides a cushioning, lubricating type substance that helps protect your joint as a whole. And so my overall points, kind of like my objectives of what I want to get across today, are movement can decrease pain and stimulate healing when done appropriately. And some of that has to do with some of those long worded compounds, long named compounds that I mentioned before. And the body wants to move, and good things do happen when we move. And we're going to start to break that down. So when I said glycoproteins, what are those? We have glycoaminoglycans and proteoglycans. These are substances within the synovial fluid and within the body, and they can be in connective tissues as well. And what they are is they're highly negatively charged, and they thus attract large amounts of water. So this results in water basically being drawn into the areas where these proteoglycans, PGs, and glycoaminoglycans, I'm going to call them GAGs for short from now on, they will draw in water when we stimulate them. So if we think about like an achy, stiff joint, how could that be really beneficial? We can naturally think of, we're drawing that water into this joint. It's becoming more lubricated. It's able to move a little bit more freely. And we can easily see why that would be a good thing, and why possibly we're feeling better after doing a little bit of light movement in the proper fashion. Also, these proteoglycans are also do basically the same thing. They draw in water, and they make our joints more fluid and bring that water content in, thus making them more lubricated and smooth to move. So I have a few studies here, and this is going to talk about why it is important to move, and it's going to kind of demonstrate the purpose that I'm saying. So all too often, let's just take your typical back pain as an example. You wake up, you have a stiff, achy back, maybe a little bit of specific pinpoint pain in a certain area. Once you get walking, moving, maybe you do a few stretches and you start to feel better. Well, why is that? There was a study done, and the first author listed is Ingram, but this study is titled "Cyclical Movement Stimulates Hyaluronan Secretion into the Synovial Cavity of Rabbit Joints." They're specifically looking at these rabbit joints here. But straight from this study, the present study has demonstrated a novel coupling between joint movement and synovial HA, that's a hyaluronan secretion. The coupling serves to protect joints during prolonged use and to replace hyaluronan loss during periods of immobility, such as overnight. Movement secretion coupling also offer a potential link between clinical benefit and exercise therapy and moderate osteoarthritis. And so let's again take another example. Think of someone with an achy hip, achy, stiff hip. It's really common if you have osteoarthritis in your hip. You wake up and it's super stiff. That's almost one of the telltale signs of osteoarthritis, or one of those first kind of check boxes, is it's stiffer in the morning. And that kind of speaks to what we just said there. You've been immobile, you've been laying down, possibly sleeping on it, but you certainly haven't been moving the hip. It can take 30, 45, maybe an hour of some good solid movement to kind of work some of that stiffness out. Working that stiffness out is that secretion of hyaluronan, stimulating the synovial fluid, stimulating those gags and proteoglycans, and thus lubricating that joint, making it prepared and easier to move. And thus it feels a lot easier once we get going. So when we think of being stiff or we think of being in pain, all too often it causes us to think, okay, let's take a rice day, right? Let's rest, ice, compress, elevate, and just hang out here. And you will be better served by moving and stimulating some of this some of these good compounds and lubricating these joints so you're much more able to move freely. As far as as far as the hyaluronan goes, it is difficult without someone to bounce it. I've never done a podcast solo. So as far as that hyaluronan goes, it proves in this study that movement induces that secretion of hyaluron, stimulates that synovial fluid. Stimulating that synovial fluid stimulates those gags and PGs, and thus draws water into the joint. And we really want that to lubricate these joints and help feel less sticky and immobile. And it's particularly important, especially when we're in pain, because all too often when we're in pain or where things are painful, we don't move or we don't want to move, right? And unfortunately, as long as there's no active injury, we're just assuming kind of general aches and pains here. You're going to be better served by doing some light, specific movements that are really just healthy and easy in this joint, that are going to help stimulate that synovial fluid and thus all these great compounds that we want. Same thing from that exact study. It just says, again, coupled with this joint usage, that it really helps stimulate that hyaluronan. So this is why maybe when you go to a physical therapy clinic and you start on the bike just to warm up, there is a purpose to that. Sometimes the purpose is to make you more warm, and thus you're easier to mobilize or manipulate as far as your joints and your soft tissues and things like that. And so it's really easy. And so it improves, my ability to come in and kind of push you into certain ranges of motion because you're more warmed up. But on top of that, this light movement can automatically just start lubricating the joints. And I see this a lot with like my total knees, osteoarthritis knees, osteoarthritis hips, that cranky hip, back, knee. All of that can really be reduced by just some cyclical light, not heavy resistance, but just light cyclical movement that's going to stimulate the synovial fluid and get all these good things that we want. As far as those gags, we know that they draw in water. Those PGs and gags, they draw in water. And thus, if we think of being more hydrated and drawing water into the cell space, we're thus more lubricated. And when we think of our bodies, I know I've mentioned this on the podcast before, so many layers of connective tissue, right? And all those layers interact on top of each other and below each other. And the more water we can get between them, we can get more fluid movement. Sometimes the restrictions of someone can be myofascial, meaning like the connective tissue between the muscles, or you can have some of these stiffer, achier joints that could be limiting you. But both of them are going to be aided by some cyclical, light, consistent movement. So overall, the whole point of what I wanted to share today is that as we move, we stimulate the synovial fluid in our joints. Synovial fluid lines most of our joints, almost all of them. Most of the joints are synovial. And the synovial fluid is produced by the synovial membrane, which, if we think of my hand here as a joint, we just take a surface, the synovial membrane, the articular cartilage that's right on top. As we move, we stimulate that synovial fluid, stimulate all those other big words that I've been using, those gags, HA, PGs, all of that good stuff. And it makes us a lot more lubricated and we can move easier. The hyaluron also protects and lubricates soft tissues, aids in repair processes and mediating cell adhesion, differentiation, mobility, and proliferation. It controls tissue hydration by retaining large quantities of water. When we stimulate gags and PGs, they draw water within the joint. And if you've ever had or heard of people getting like a gel injection into their knee, this is kind of doing something similar. So we talked about synovial fluid. The point of that, or something that does, is provide that cushion between the joints and lubricating it. When you go to a doctor and they give you one of these injections in the knee, like a gel injection, I hear about these all the time. It's meant to kind of provide a little bit layer of cushioning for the knee and thus make it less painful to move, and you can move more freely. And that is the exact goal of the cyclical movement with synovial fluid. So you can use this to your own. You can build an example based off anything that you have right now. So if you just think of your ankles, maybe they feel kind of stiff right now. If you just pump them up and down 20, 30 times, ankle circles 20, 30 times, all of that is going to stimulate that synovial fluid, and you'll feel a little bit more mobile within those joints. And if not, at the very least, more freely able to move through the range that you have been moving. So in short, movement heals, movement draws in blood, especially when we're using our muscles. And what do we think about blood? We think blood brings the food for our body and the nutrition to create this optimal healing environment, which is definitely what we want. And then this light cyclical movement has this extra benefit on joints to where we can begin to stimulate that synovial fluid, lubricate the joints, and thus voila, the joint is less painful, less stiff, more freely able to move, and we're much better off for it. And it doesn't take much. So I have some examples of exercises like this on YouTube. Like one, for example, I've got an achy right hip. It is one of the things I deal with where I wake up in the morning and it's one of those things that's just stiff already. And I've got to kind of undo that every morning. And I do these standing hip circles that you can look up on YouTube. And that's a perfect example of just what I'm trying to do is move that ball and socket synovial joint through the range, stimulate that synovial fluid, and lubricate that joint. And it also has a protective benefit. In my case, I'm hoping protects me from getting a total hip replacement in the long run, because I'm constantly stimulating the synovial fluid, stimulating the blood flow, stimulating the PGs, the gags, and hopefully helping to heal the surface of these joints. It's kind of like what I was talking about a few podcasts ago. And so if you go back and listen to our knees over toes episode, I was talking about how it may be actually helpful to go through these ranges. And part of that is and I was talking about Wolff's Law and how it relates to bone growth and how maybe this will help our cartilage heal and grow. This kind of draws in my point of especially the cyclical movement study, where if we go through these ranges, we stimulate these good compounds, and thus we have the opportunity to heal the integrity of those joints. And that's exactly what we want to do. And so, in short, what I hope this podcast gets across is movement heals, movement is helpful. Very few times is immobility and not moving and just straight rest going to make you feel any better or get you better. As a matter of fact, more than likely, it's just going to slow your progress on your way to a full recovery. If you have any questions about any of this, I'm more than happy to answer any of these questions. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about with clients in the clinic. And the key here is just motion is lotion. The more you move, the more you stimulate these great compounds that make you feel better moving, the more they help heal different body parts, including and hopefully our joint cartilage. And thus we can stave off things like arthritis that seem to be so common. So happy moving, keep it cyclical, keep it light, a light walk, a light bike ride, just light circles of the joint, moving the joint in the way it's intended to move with low resistance. Great way to stimulate the synovial fluid without exacerbating any pre-existing situation. If you have questions about your specific situation, feel free to hit me up. Bryan Brozy or B Brozy on every social media. And you can find me at BWellPTFL.com. And I'm happy to talk with you there. Until next time, and hopefully we've got Keoni. Be well.